Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm talking about my Week 3 waiver wire targets for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, I believe I can speak for all of us when I say that going from Week 1 into Week 2, we all saw a significant jump in terms of overall fantasy production. Now, in terms of all 32 teams in the National Football League in Week 1, they all combined for 656 points, whether it is offense or special teams or even defensive points. Going into Week 2, without the Monday night games and the 4 teams that have yet to play, we have already seen Week 2 contribute 711 total points. A huge jump thus far, as we really did experience Week 1 of the NFL season being the 4th preseason game. And now that we are beginning to gain momentum, or nearly at the end of Week 2 and entering Week 3, we can see the full fantasy football stride take place and the momentum builds for the remainder of the season. Now, with all being said, we are going into Week 3 with the idea of trying to continue to improve our rosters and gain more talent via the waiver wire. We're going to be talking about players at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, defense, and kicker positions. Now, even though I'm going to be mentioning a boatload of players, the overall upside and potential fruitfulness of the fantasy prospects that are going to be available in majority of leagues aren't going to be as high upside as what we experienced last week. Now, before we get into all that, a reminder, for those of you who have yet to do so, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we are trying to get to our goal of 80,000 subscribers. So for those of you who are looking for daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you win a fantasy football championship, be sure to do so today. At the end of today's episode, after I go over all of the potential waiver wire options, I'll be putting together some pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy for tonight's Monday Night Football games, of course, between the Carolina Panthers, New Orleans Saints, and of course, Cleveland Browns and Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, for those of you guys who haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, travel down to the description of the video, because if you go ahead, click on the link and use code Andrew to sign up and make a first-time deposit, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you're going to be able to get my rankings every single Sunday morning sent from me directly to you, with all the rankings, whether it is by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, kicker, and defense, flex, half PPR, full PPR. All the available rankings that you need to have an advantage for the remainder of the season. Take advantage of the opportunity. Help me help you. For those of you who are interested in checking out Underdog Fantasy, whether it is, tailing the potential pick'em plays or even getting the rankings for the remainder of the season, in order to determine eligibility, the map on the right side of the screen should be able to give you an understanding as to whether or not you're eligible based on your current location. And of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much. All right, so let's talk about players that should have already been rostered based on last week's waiver wire targets episode. First and foremost, Kyren Williams, who is currently rostered in 61% of Yahoo leagues and 64% of sleeper leagues, should have already been picked up. The fact that he had to go ahead and have himself another big week to potentially get even higher rostership percentage is pretty ridiculous to me. Nonetheless, we do have a situation here now that Cam Akers was officially inactive in Week 2. We truly have the clear RB1 of the LA Rams, and the value that he is providing is immense. Besides scoring 25 fantasy points, he has been one of the best fantasy running backs thus far this season, having scored 4 total touchdowns. He is number 1 amongst all running backs in routes ran, and of course, he's number 1 amongst all running backs in total targets. The overall contributions that Kyren Williams has presented should have had him near 70+% in terms of roster percentage. Nonetheless, if he's available, he's got to be picked up already. Now, Nico Collins, another one of these players from last week, he already demonstrated that he's the number 1 receiving option of this offense. He went ahead and put up an incredible week of 24 fantasy points, 7 catches, 146 and a touchdown. The fact of the matter is the Houston Texans are throwing the ball more than just about anybody. Besides the fact that CJ Stroud, the rookie quarterback, has 91 passing attempts thus far. He's number 4 amongst all quarterbacks in passing yards thus far this season. And the number 1 receiving option of that offense is obviously going to benefit, and that is Nico Collins. Now, on the other hand, we have guys like Justice Hill and Gus Edwards that are filling in for J.K. Dobbins' absence, of course, due to his Achilles injury that we knew was sustained last week. Players that, again, you could have picked up one or the other and potentially found success. Now, even though Gus Edwards was the guy that scored the rushing touchdown in Week 2, in terms of overall snap counts out of this backfield, Justice Hill led the bunch. He had himself more rushing attempts, had himself more receiving work, and it's just a matter of that touchdown making the biggest difference maker. So both of these guys are going to have value, but going forward, it is a two-headed monster within this backfield. Kenneth Gainwell had himself an incredible Week 1, demonstrated that, and even though he missed Week 2 due to the rib injury, he is still going to be an active participant in this backfield due to the fact that Rashad Penny and Boston Scott are really afterthoughts behind Kenneth Gainwell and DeAndre Swift going forward. And when we move on to Zack Moss, the final player that should have already been rostered, I mean, we're talking about Nico Collins that is rostered in 60+% of leagues. Gus Edwards 60+, Kenneth Gainwell 60+, Zack Moss 52+% of leagues, Yahoo and Sleeper. It was abundantly clear last week based on all of the terrible fumbles that Deion Jackson had that Zack Moss coming back from injury was immediately going to make an impact, as he did late last season for the Indianapolis Colts. And he had himself a great matchup, and he delivered 18.7 fantasy points. We know that Jonathan Taylor is eventually going to return, but until then, he's a great fill-in back. Again, players that are currently rostered in more than 50% of leagues, just want to mention them as guys that if in fact you're playing in a smaller league, 8 to 10 teams, these guys should be on roster immediately as their contributions are incredible for the remainder of the season. Now let's go and talk about players that honestly are more of stash plays going forward and are widely available amongst all fantasy leagues. At this current moment in time, we begin with our number one, Roschon Johnson, currently rostered in 38% of Yahoo leagues. In terms of overall snap counts, Roschon Johnson played 42%, while Khalil Herbert played 60%. There were a couple snaps in which they both played on the field at the same time. Nonetheless, we're beginning to trend in the direction of Roschon Johnson potentially overtaking this backfield, primarily because Khalil Herbert has not played up to his overall potential. D'Onta Foreman in week 2 was a healthy scratch, which means he was healthy to play, but they did not activate him because they did not believe he needed to be active for the game. Therefore, they're allowing Roschon Johnson to leapfrog him within the overall offense, a guy that as the weeks progress is going to be more and more of a valuable option within this backfield, especially once, in fact, the Chicago Bears finally find their stride. Now, the next player we want to mention is Matt Breida. He's only rostered in 2% of leagues on Yahoo, 3% on Sleeper. Matt Breida, the only reason he is at number 2 is primarily because of the injury that Saquon Barkley sustained yesterday late in the game against the Arizona Cardinals. Unfortunately, Saquon Barkley is most likely not going to be available for Thursday's game against the San Francisco 49ers. So if in fact you are in need of a running back in order to fill in for Saquon Barkley, Matt Breida would be the guy who's going to be the next man up within their backfield. Now, even though it is not an exciting matchup overall going up against the San Francisco 49ers, this is an injury that could last Saquon Barkley for multiple weeks. So if in fact you need the efforts of a running back to fill in while you have Saquon Barkley injured and recovering, Matt Breida would be the guy to go after. Now, another player that is benefiting from the potential injury of another running back within their backfield is Craig Reynolds stepping in for David Montgomery. Craig Reynolds is currently rostered in 0% of leagues. So Craig Reynolds has a pure opportunity of being picked up by you going into the given week, primarily because David Montgomery left the game yesterday against the Seattle Seahawks early. He even mentioned and admitted after the game it's going to take a couple weeks to heal the current thigh bruise that he's dealing with. Now, I don't know what the overall extent of that injury is. Missing a couple weeks isn't something to kind of glance past, but ultimately, Craig Reynolds is going to step up and be the primary rushing back of this team. Even though we expect Jahmyr Gibbs to get more touches, Craig Reynolds is going to be in this overall rotation. Going back to 2021, weeks 14 and 15, when Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift were both out throughout those 2 weeks, weeks 14 and 15 of 2021. Craig Reynolds in those 2 games, 11 carries, 83 yards, 2 catches, 16 for 10.9 fantasy points and a half PPR. And in the following game, 26 carries, 112, 1 catch for 5 yards, 12.2 fantasy points. We have seen him be valuable within this backfield, especially considering the incredible offensive line that he's behind. Craig Reynolds certainly has value in the next couple weeks with David Montgomery missing time. Now we move to Tyjae Spears. Tyjae Spears in week 1 outsnapped Derrick Henry. In week 2, we saw a complete flip in which Derrick Henry got put back to playing 70% of the offensive snaps, but ultimately Derrick Henry is getting older and they want to keep him off the field as much as they possibly can unless they're going to utilize him. And with that being the case, Tyjae Spears has the ability of not just only being a handcuff, but going forward having potential value with the overall touches that he is given. Of course, this last week had 10 total touches. If he's able to make a huge play, 8 carries for 49 yards is no joke, but if he's able to make a huge play, could be, a potential flex option with touchdown upside depending on the given week, but obviously is a high caliber handcuff going forward. And so is a guy like Ty Chandler. Ty Chandler is associated with Alexander Mattison, who obviously is coming off of 2 weeks in which he had tough matchups. And even though the Thursday night football game against the Philadelphia Eagles really doesn't demonstrate the pure upside of Alexander Mattison, if this team begins to trend in the direction, just like the public is, in terms of, hey, we need to replace Alexander Mattison, then of course Ty Chandler will be the next man up. But I truly believe Alexander Mattison is a better running back than Ty Chandler. It's just a matter of the offensive line injuries and of course the matchups on hand for the first 2 weeks that have really put Alexander Mattison in a tough position. The final player we want to mention is someone that is currently on the injured reserve. You can pick him up and slot him into your injured reserve spot immediately. It's Jeff Wilson Jr., currently only rostered in 25% of Yahoo leagues, 21% of sleeper leagues, a player that is going to be able to be a 1-2 tandem with Raheem Mostert. Even though Raheem Mostert put up an incredible game, they had a lot of glimpses of Salvon Ahmed within that backfield and also Devon Achane, who really did play yesterday, but wasn't a factor and wasn't an impact player overall. So as soon as we see Jeff Wilson return, he will make an impact and get himself a good volume of touches. Now, when we move on to the wide receiver position, some of these players we already mentioned on last week's episode, but unfortunately, a lot of you didn't go out and potentially pick them up. Perhaps you don't have enough bench spots available, but going forward, these prospects should be prioritized. Now, mainly going into week 3, we have Davante Adams, Jalen Waddle, both of them on concussion protocols. Zay Jones obviously dealing with a knee injury. There is a potential in which these players could absolutely make an impact for you. First and foremost, Tutu Atwell, currently only rostered in 25% of Yahoo leagues, 32% of sleeper leagues. This is another consecutive week in which he has demonstrated being the number 2 receiving option of the Los Angeles Rams. With Matthew Stafford number 3 amongst all quarterbacks in the National Football League thus far in terms of passing yardage, I can honestly tell you that as a Los Angeles Rams fan, I did not anticipate the competitiveness and of course the upside of what this offense was able to provide thus far this season, and going forward, it's only going to continue to develop as this offense continues to protect Matthew Stafford, and a guy like Tutu Atwell is his number 2 favorite target going forward, considering Atwell is able to get the job done near the line of scrimmage, but also is a deep receiving threat. He has the pedigree as a former second-round pick to potentially be an option that could be even better for fantasy purposes as we move forward. Now, we move on to Josh Reynolds, a player that we mentioned last week, currently only rostered in 12% of Yahoo leagues, 21% of sleeper leagues, coming off an incredible week of 5 catches, 66 and 2 touchdowns in a great matchup, played very well. Ultimately, the injury that Amon-Ra St. Brown sustained late in the game in which he was dealing with quote-unquote cramps, we don't know if that is really what it was. We'll have to wait until Tuesday, Wednesday to see whether or not Amon-Ra St. Brown is truly on the injury report as to whether it is cramps or whether he's good to go. Hopefully it is cramps, but either way, Josh Reynolds is the number 2 receiving option of this team going forward, and considering how high upside this offense is in terms of scoring the football, regardless of what their defense does, I mean, honestly, we're hoping that the Detroit Lions defense just gives up more and more points just like they did last week. Therefore, it'll allow Josh Reynolds to be even more relevant for fantasy purposes going forward. Move on to our number 3, Tank Dell. He's a rookie wide receiver. When CJ Stroud was selected by the Houston Texans, he told the GM and head coach, I need you guys to draft Tank Dell. And that's exactly what they went ahead and did. Tank Dell, considering the fact that Noah Brown went to the injured reserve last week, was going to get more of a role, and that's exactly what he did. He played 66 overall snaps, 10 targets, 7 catches, 72 yards and a touchdown, 16.7 half PPR fantasy points. In an offense, like I mentioned earlier, that has had 91 passing attempts in the first 2 weeks, and their quarterback is 4th amongst all in terms of total passing yards. Guys like Tank Dell, and moving on to Robert Woods, continue to maintain value. Robert Woods with another consecutive week of over 10 fantasy points, over 9 potential targets. We're continuing to see a high volume of opportunity for these wide receivers, considering how much of an offensive line deficiency they have and the running game no longer being a factor. Therefore, the fact that this defense for the Houston Texans has not played well, it is only going to allow Robert Woods, Tank Dell, and of course Nico Collins to be fantasy relevant going forward. Jayden Reed is our number 5, primarily because the absence of Christian Watson has opened up a void for receiving touchdowns within this offense. Jordan Love amongst all quarterbacks in the National Football League is number 1, tied with Kirk Cousins for total passing touchdowns. That is an unbelievable number, and we're glad to see that Jordan Love is immediately finding success after the overall regime of Aaron Rodgers that was so successful over the course of the past decade plus. Nonetheless, Jayden Reed, a rookie wide receiver, primarily playing as the slot receiver of this team, with Romeo Doubs obviously pulling heavy coverage. If in fact we're going to see Romeo Doubs, of course, guys like Christian Watson return, underneath, Jayden Reed can continue to make upside plays within this offense, only rostered in 10% of the league, a guy that you might want to go ahead and stash going forward. The final option is DeVante Parker. We could have put anybody else here. There's a lot of other options, Khalif Raymond. There's other options in terms of Marvin Mims. But as of last night's game, DeVante Parker hauled in 8 targets, 6 catches, 57 yards. And that was just his first week back from the injury, only rostered in 2% of leagues. He could end up continuing to get more and more potential with Mac Jones, who I learned last night, his real name is Michael McCorkle Jones. Just putting it out there, DeVante Parker, not a bad option. Let's move on to the tight end position. Beginning with our number 1, speaking of the New England Patriots, it's Hunter Henry. I didn't put enough respect on Hunter Henry's name after week 1's performance. This man has put up 14.1 and 14.2 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks. Now, despite the fact that his touchdown yesterday, which truly did make his overall fantasy week, we had 4 illegal men down the field. That was an illegal play that should have been penalized, yet Hunter Henry was able to get away with it and be fantasy relevant. It's incredible. He's currently already rostered in 54% of leagues, so I don't expect him to be available, but if he is, a great tight end option for those of us who do not have great tight end success, considering the position is so lackluster thus far this season. Moving on to Zach Ertz, currently only rostered in 10% of leagues. He currently leads all tight ends in the National Football League in terms of total targets, with 18 thus far, putting up 8.6 fantasy points against the New York Giants. He's continuing the trend in the right direction, obviously coming off of that ACL injury from last year. Jake Ferguson, number 3, Again, when you're associated with the Dallas Cowboys offense, you're going to be given high quality overall opportunities, especially down in the red zone. Amongst all players in the National Football League in the first 2 weeks, Jake Ferguson is number 1 in terms of overall red zone targets with 7, and number 1 amongst all options in terms of red zone targets inside the 10-yard line. That in itself continues to build confidence in the idea that Jake Ferguson will continue to be a primary option within this offense. Currently rostered in 38% of leagues, potentially available going forward. Logan Thomas, even though he may be in the concussion protocol going into the given week, he did haul in a touchdown the last 2 weeks, consisting of 6.3 and 9.2 fantasy points. A lot better than many of the other options. And considering how much of a kind of grimy, feisty team the Washington Commanders are, they're going to continue to scratch and claw until the very last whistle. And ultimately, as long as that's going to be the case, no matter who they play, whether it's a negative or positive game script, Logan Thomas will be an effective part, considering Eric Bieniemy's influence within this offense, obviously a former offensive coordinator of the Kansas City Chiefs, and the influences that they had with Travis Kelce there. The final 2 options are Tyler Conklin and, of course, Cade Otton. Tyler Conklin, 8.2 fantasy points, only rostered in 4% of leagues. He may potentially be Zach Wilson's number 1 target going forward. 6 total targets, 5 catches, 50 yards is decent for a tight end, but it's a matter of who is going to be the number 1 target for Zach Wilson. And if he's going to find a security blanket in Tyler Conklin, could be of value. Unfortunately, he does take on New England Patriots this week, but even last year, he had himself a huge game of 7 catches, over 70 yards, and 2 touchdowns against Bill Belichick's defense. So it's not terrible, but obviously Zach Wilson makes it a little bit more difficult. The final option is Cade Otton. They do take on the Philadelphia Eagles. That is one of the most potentially advantageous matchups at the tight end position, considering he's coming off of a week of 6 catches on 6 targets and 41 receiving yards. Not a bad option as a second-year tight end. We move on to the quarterback conversation. Now, going into this week, we have Joe Burrow, who is currently re-aggravated his calf injury, may miss some time, and Anthony Richardson, who is currently on the concussion protocol, could miss this week, and Gardner Minshew could fill in for him. As of right now, if I'm looking to replace those quarterbacks on my roster, or I'm potentially not satisfied with the overall contributions of Justin Fields thus far, we look to players like Jordan Love. Again, leads the league in terms of total passing touchdowns thus far from weeks 1 through 2, 6 total, tied with Kirk Cousins amongst all quarterbacks. Takes on New Orleans in week 3. We have Derek Carr, currently available in 60% of Yahoo leagues, only rostered in 40%. Takes on the Green Bay Packers in week 2. He has yet to play against the Carolina Panthers, but I'm expecting him to play well. Matthew Stafford, currently only rostered in 35% of Yahoo leagues, takes on the Cincinnati Bengals. The way that Matthew Stafford has played, considering he's number 3 amongst all quarterbacks in passing yardage, the offensive line has played incredibly, protecting him against the defensive line of the San Francisco 49ers. Imagine when Cooper Kupp comes back. I think Matthew Stafford could get back to being a top 15 fantasy quarterback on a consistent basis, when in fact his number 1 is back and this offense takes an even bigger jump going forward. Sam Howell is our number 4. Sam Howell looks like an angry bird to me. I don't know what it is. His face just gives me like I don't know which angry bird I'm talking about, but I got to go look up some images. But as soon as I looked at him for a second there, I'm like, he reminds me of an angry bird. Nonetheless, he's a quarterback that over the course of his career, in the 3 starts that he has made, whether it's last season or this season, he has scored a minimum of 2 touchdowns every single game. He takes on Buffalo next week. It is a tougher matchup, but this team continues to fight every single down until the very end, and somehow he's still fantasy relevant every single week. Moving on to CJ Stroud, our number 5, takes on Jacksonville, currently only rostered in 9% of Yahoo leagues. He's the number 4 quarterback in terms of overall passing yardage, like I've mentioned before, 91 passing attempts in the first 2 games for their starting offensive line when we were out last week. And regardless of all of that, CJ Stroud continues to play well. The final player is Baker Mayfield. They take on the Philadelphia Eagles defense. Avonte Maddox, their primary nickel corner, had himself surgery. If in fact James Bradbury is going to miss more time, Nakobe Dean is going to miss more time, or potentially even Blankenship, their safety, they could be undermanned. And if that's going to be the case, Baker Mayfield in the first 2 weeks of the season has played incredibly for fantasy purposes, and honestly could be an option if you're in a really tight bind going into the given week against a pretty advantageous matchup where their secondary has not played well. Now, before we continue on with some kickers and defenses, a reminder for those of you guys who haven't checked out the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description, check out andrewkirchhoffshop.com. Not only rep the brand of 1.01, but of course, greetings and salutations. It's something that I continue to say. It's kind of my catchphrase. Nonetheless, again, we're providing high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothing for your upcoming stressful fantasy football Sunday. So be sure to go ahead, support, and check out the website today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about kickers, defense, and special teams. The 3 kickers that I wanted to mention have all already scored 28 points this season. Brandon Aubrey, only rostered in 6% of leagues. Brett Maher, only rostered in 2% of leagues. Nick Folk, rostered in 28% of leagues. Each of these 3 kickers have already scored 28 points. Brandon Aubrey has scored 10 in week 1, 18 in week 2. Brett Maher, 15 in week 1, 13 in week 2. and Nick Folk, 18 in week 1, 10 in week 2. These players should be picked up. McPherson's, Carlson's, they're not getting the job done. We need fantasy points. If Jake Moody is somehow available in your league, he should be the number one guy. But in terms of overall rostership percentage, these are the guys that I'm going after in the given week. Now, when we talk about defenses for this upcoming week, for those of you who are playing a weekly kind of pick up and play role, the Kansas City Chiefs should be number one. Even though they're rostered in 39% of leagues, I'm assuming that 39% number is based on auto drafts, where people kind of disappear in the second half, because typically you wouldn't start that defense. Nonetheless, in week 1 and 2, the Kansas City Chiefs put up 4 fantasy points and 10 fantasy points. They take on the Chicago Bears. Chicago Bears defenses that have gone against them in week 1 and week 2, 15 fantasy points and 17 fantasy points. That is the Green Bay Packers and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm expecting a lot of success from Kansas City defense this upcoming week, and they play against the New York Jets in week 4. Then we move on to the Jacksonville Jaguars, currently rostered in only 15% of Yahoo leagues. They take on Houston. Jacksonville in the first 2 weeks, in terms of their defensive fantasy points, 11 and 8. Defenses against the Houston Texans offense have been able to score 11 and 9 fantasy points in the first 2 weeks. Again, another great play. The Seattle Seahawks currently only rostered in 8% of leagues. Not really a surprise there. In the first 2 games of the Seahawks season, they only put up 1 fantasy point against the Rams and 13 this last week against the Detroit Lions. Ultimately, they take on the Carolina Panthers. And even though we haven't seen the New Orleans Saints take on Bryce Young, they're going to probably struggle. And with that probably being the case, we expect the Seattle Seahawks to be a great matchup against the Carolina Panthers, and they also take on the New York Giants in week 4. Could be an advantageous matchup on hand. With that all covered, that is going to conclude our waiver wire portion of today's episode. We're going to go ahead, we're going to transition into talking about some underdog pick'em slips that we're going to be putting together for tonight's game between the Carolina Panthers, New Orleans Saints, and of course, Cleveland Browns and Pittsburgh Steelers. Thank you very much. Now, during yesterday's live stream that I was conducting from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, like I'll do every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, with updated rankings, answering your questions to the best of my ability, somebody asked me, Andrew, what is your underdog pick'em of the week? And I quickly was like, all right, let me go ahead and just put together a slip. And luckily, Christian McCaffrey, 0.5 total yards, was available as like the premium slip of the weekend, which was fantastic. I went ahead and put together a 5-leg slip. And unfortunately, it didn't allow me to put, or actually, I would say, fortunately, it didn't allow me to put Brock Purdy, 1.5 passing touchdowns with Deebo Samuel, because you can't put total touchdowns and fantasy points from players on the same team on the same slip. So because Brock Purdy popped up as an error on yesterday's overall live stream, I just removed him from the slip and said, okay, we got to get back to answering questions. Let's put this through. And boy, did it deliver. Overall, fantastic. And we're going to hopefully continue the streak tonight with the overall matchups that we have on hand based on the overall players that I'm going to be putting together in a pick'em slip right now. For those of you who are interested, potentially following, fading, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, there's a link down in the description. When you use code Andrew, not only are you going to get a first-time deposit match up to $100. So again, base minimum, $10 deposit. You'll get 10 additional. Max $100 deposit, you'll get $100 match. Not only will you receive that, you'll receive weekly emails every single Sunday morning, like I've mentioned, with my rankings sent to you directly from my email. So be sure to check your spam folder, which will include flex, half PPR, full PPR, all of what you need for every single Sunday for the remainder of the season. Now, prior to the recording of this video, I was looking at potential pick'em slips that I wanted to put together. Jamal Williams had a rushing yard total. They removed that because probably Kendre Miller is not going to play tonight. I already had him in a slip earlier this week that is yet to kind of conclude at, I think it was like 52.5 rushing yards. He's going to be able to eclipse that. The last one that I saw was 58.5. I was going to suggest higher on it. If in fact it returns, be sure to check it out on your end. I would take higher on that overall number. But some of the overall plays that I like, I like the idea of Blake Grupe having himself a solid week here. He did have a number of 2 PATs scored higher or lower. That one is pretty difficult to kind of predict because they would have to score 3 touchdowns within the overall game. But ultimately, a couple of the plays that I like doesn't really revolve around the first game of the night, which is the Carolina Panthers taking on the New Orleans Saints. I really like the idea of Nick Chubb, primarily in the matchup against the defense that no longer has Cameron Hayward. In terms of stopping the run against Nick Chubb, it is absolutely going to be a difficult task on hand. Now, despite that being the case, the number that I actually really like in terms of all these is his overall receiving yards. Again, Jerome Ford is not a receiving back. With no more Kareem Hunt, I think 13.5 receiving yards is very much so an eclipsable number in the given matchup. Another player that I like within this matchup is David Njoku. Like I've mentioned all week, Kevin Stefanski makes it a point to get his tight ends heavily utilized within the given matchup. I personally like the 35.5 receiving yard number because in order to get himself 7.25, we're going to need to be able to get ourselves a touchdown. And I don't know if the volume of overall receptions with the contributions of Harrison Bryant and Jordan Akins is as capable Therefore, we're going to go with the 35.5 receiving yards, going higher on that number. And the final player that I like for tonight's game, already had it selected, is Kenny Pickett, going higher than 30.5 passing attempts. I'm expecting this offense to find struggles in terms of running the ball, considering their offensive line injuries and considering that defensive line has a lot of talent that they've upgraded this offseason with Jim Schwartz as their defensive coordinator. They're going to make it very difficult for Najee Harris tonight. His current number is 51.5 rushing yards. He's very much so could eclipse that number, but it very much so is sketchy based on the given week. Therefore, I'm going to expect Kenny Pickett to throw the ball a bunch. Those are the 3 players that I'm putting together in a pick'em slip tonight. I'll go ahead and confirm that, and we're good to go. Again, for those of you who are interested, you can check out Underdog Fantasy right now. Put together a pick'em slip for tonight's game. Again, there's a lot of potential players, and there's even potential Thursday night, numbers that are already out and available. So for those of you who are interested, be sure to go ahead, use the link down in the description, use code Andrew. Until tomorrow, we'll be talking about our running back rankings for week 3 of the 2023 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Enjoy tonight's game, and I'll see you guys. Peace.